So, what are some of the symptoms people are suffering with who are drinking water that is contaminated by wastewater from the scrubbers at the coal-powered power plants?
One of the things that's hard about this is it's hard to know exactly what the symptoms are. So there's some types of water pollution, for instance, bacteria that you drink, and you'll have a stomach ache the next day or later that day. And you know that that's from the water. But the most scary types of water pollution and health effects are things that take sometimes years to develop. So let's take arsenic, which is a common byproduct from scrubbers. If arsenic gets into your water supply, we know from studies that it can cause cancer. It can cause cancer of the stomach, of the throat, of the bladder. Basically, anything that comes into contact with can develop cancer. But sometimes it can take years to develop. It's something that accumulates, that causes repeated mutations in the cells of your body that eventually becomes a cancer. So very frequently, someone can be exposed to a pollutant or to a chemical for quite a while and have no symptoms, no negative effects. But over time, they'll develop a cancer. Another good example of this is a pesticide called atrazine, which we did an article about. Atrazine is one of the most common pesticides in the United States. It is the most common pesticide in water sources. So almost everyone in the United States drinks atrazine at some point during the year. Atrazine, for almost all of us, is completely safe. If you or I were to drink atrazine, it probably wouldn't do anything to us in our water supply. But there's now studies emerging that say if you're a pregnant woman and if you're at a certain time of development of your fetus, exposing that fetus to atrazine can be disastrous. There's suggestions that atrazine is linked to birth defects, to reproductive problems, to preterm birth, which is a huge killer of infants, to children being born, with terrible, terrible deformities. But it turns out that, and we don't know exactly when, that atrazine is probably only really dangerous if you drink it during a certain time. So to answer your question, it's hard to say exactly what the symptoms are or what the diseases look like. And it's hard to say even that the water is the only cause of that disease or is a provable cause. But it is clear that there are things in the water systems, particularly now, that we know from laboratory tests can cause cancers or birth defects or can kill us, and that people are drinking that water.
Now, let's get back to the scrubbing process that's
Okay.
used at a lot of energy plants that are powered by coal. And again, for listeners just joining us, this is a process that's preventing the pollutants from going out in the air. But in order to prevent the pollutants from going out into the air, there's a way that they're washed out, and that water with the pollutants in it is ending up in rivers and in groundwater and in many people's tap water as a result. So, how effective is the Environmental Protection Agency in monitoring what's going on with the contaminants from the scrubbing process?
Not very effective so far. And there's two big reasons why. The first of which is, as we discussed a little bit before, the Clean Water Act is simply not being enforced. So one way that you could regulate these power plants is that you could use the Clean Water Act to really sort of bring the hammer down on them. But if the Clean Water Act isn't being enforced, if it isn't being used,
Why isn't it being
then
enforced? Let's just stop there for a second.
there's a couple of reasons why I'm told by the regulators themselves. The first of which is that this just hasn't been a priority on Capitol Hill for a number of years. Obviously, under the Bush administration, there was a very different attitude towards environmental regulation. And so I'm told by EPA staffers that under Bush, they were told to stop prosecuting polluters. They were told to take some of their biggest prosecutions and put them on a shelf. Although it didn't start with Bush, it actually started under Clinton. There was, President Clinton in a lot of ways was very pro-environment, but that had limits, particularly when it came up against certain industries. Arkansas, where obviously he was from, was very dependent on agriculture. Agriculture is a big polluter of water. And so basically on Capitol Hill, because people have stopped caring, voters have stopped caring about water pollution, it just hasn't been a priority, and that means it hasn't been a priority for the EPA. But at the state level, the reason why the Clean Water Act isn't being enforced, and states have primary responsibility usually for enforcing the Clean Water Act, The reason why is because, simply put, they just don't have the resources. The average Department of Environmental Protection's budget has remained essentially flat over the last decade, while the number of facilities that they have to police has doubled. So as a result, they just don't have the manpower to go out there and actually enforce the law.
What about lobbyists? What are lobbyists up to?
Lobbyists spend a lot of time on this, particularly when it comes to things like coal-fired power plants. The electric industry and the power industry is one of the largest donors to political campaigns. And they've worked very, very hard to make sure that there aren't new regulations on power plants. You had asked how the EPA is doing on regulating power plants. The second part of the answer to that is that the EPA actually doesn't have rules specifically for power plants, and a lot of people say this is an oversight. Lisa Jackson, who's the new head of the EPA, has said that she's going to try and push through new rules. But until now, the EPA has treated power plants just like gas stations or your local grocery store or anyone else. They haven't created special rules that say, even though you're burning coal 24 hours a day and you're dumping a whole bunch of stuff into the river, you have to live by certain rules. They haven't passed those rules. And lobbyists have worked very, very hard to make sure that there haven't been new rules.
Let's just look at another source of pollution that you've written about, and that's the runoff from farms, from fertilizer on farms. And just
Right.
to give an example of this, you write about one county in Wisconsin with more than 41,000 dairy cows. And these 41,000 cows, produce more than 260 million gallons of manure each year. It's a lot of manure.
It's a lot of manure.
Yeah. So what happens to this massive amount of manure after it's produced?
Well, I went up to this farm, one of the farms in this county, and it's absolutely fascinating because dairies, it's a dairy farm, and dairies have to be big to survive now. And so one of the things that they do is they give the cows this high protein grain because it helps them produce milk, and cows are milked 3 times a day. One of the consequences of giving a cow high protein grain is that it produces liquid manure. So they have this conveyor belt that basically sweeps the manure away as soon as it's produced, that's working all the time. So you walk into this barn that's filled with a couple hundred cows, and it's almost spotless. The manure is removed immediately. All the cows are happy because happy cows are milk better, etc. When the manure is taken away, they got to do something with it. So they put it into this huge pond, and then they spray it onto fields. Now, in part, that's a great thing because manure is a fertilizer and they need to grow corn to feed the cows, and so the manure helps grow the corn. But they produce so much manure at this point that they just run out of land to spray it on. And so they just spray and spray and double spray. The average cow produces a manure equivalent to 19 humans. And so as a result, it's just a lot of manure. And so, as I was driving through Wisconsin, you just saw huge, huge trucks constantly spraying manure onto the ground because they got to get rid of it.
And does that get into our water?
Yeah, it does. Particularly people who live near those fields. What happened up in Wisconsin is that they sprayed manure on frozen ground, and so it couldn't seep through the ground, and it just built up and built up. And then they had an early thaw, and as soon as the ground thawed out, months worth of manure started filtering through the soil into the water system, and literally within 12 hours, people's wells went bad, and they were drinking water that contained E. coli and bacteria. One woman, for instance, had a 6-month-old child, and she only breastfed it, so the child didn't drink any water, but she was giving it a bath, and the baby sucked on a wash rag and got so sick that it had to be hospitalized. There's a lot of when the things that can persist in water tend to be things that are fairly hardy, and things that are hardy can do a lot of damage to humans.